If you ask me which developer had the most uncontested run, the way a filmmaker can define a decade or a musician can own an era, I'd say it was Nintendo Research and Development 1, between the year 2000 and 2004. It's an odd claim to make about a now defunct department inside a publisher not exactly short on greatness. Stranger still, because this was the period where the rest of the industry had largely moved on to cutting-edge 3D games, while R&D 1 was still working in the miniature world of low-powered 2D hardware. But that was always their zone. Following the philosophy of their founder, Gunpei Yokoi, R&D 1 understood constraints not as limitations but as creative launchpads, whether it was pursuing platforming perfection with their Wario Land series, or expanding the action-adventure genre with Metroid on the home consoles, amongst other work. And across 4 years, 4 games, 2 series and 1 device, they delivered some of their finest work. Wario Land 4, Metroid Fusion, WarioWare MegaMicroRetro, and Metroid Zero Mission, all of them on the Game Boy Advance. To my mind, the GBA was the perfect fit for them. This was the team that helped define portable play in the first place, shepherding major works on the Game & Watch and Game Boy, hardware they had developed internally. The GBA, then the Nintendo DS after it, proved that portable games weren't just smaller versions of home console experiences, but their own distinct culture, one that made room for visual novels like Ace Attorney, daily ritual games like Nintendogs and Brain Training, and all manner of eclectic titles that needed to be unshackled from the television to find their audience. You don't really get mobile games without that lineage. Arguably, you don't get the same bright world of independent development platforms like Flash, GameMaker, Twine, and Pico 8 without that wider understanding that small, immediate, and personal games could matter. R&D 1 understood that instinctively, and it's a shame they never really got to show the world what they could do beyond this era, as much of their talent ended up restructured into Nintendo and Intelligent Systems. But the Game Boy Advance is where they hit their final and most important stride. They redefined Samus Aran at the beginning of the Metroidvania boom, securing an identity for the series beyond simply repeating Super Metroid's template, and used that newfound spirit to reinvigorate where our adventures began. They also delivered, in my mind, the finest platformer on the system and one of the best ever made. Wario Land 4 sits perfectly between where R&D 1 had been and where they were about to go. It's a platform adventure starring their homegrown anti-mascot Wario, following in their established formula of exploring open levels in search of fabulous treasure, until halfway through each you hit a switch and the whole thing transforms into a rapid-fire reflex test. Hurry up! Spaces you previously sauntered at a leisurely place suddenly become high-speed obstacle courses as you rush back to cash in your haul. For their next Wario outing, this idea would cross-pollinate with an unlikely source. While R&D 1 had mostly sat out of the N64 era with no 3D Metroid and no proper Wario platformer for the system, they did work on Mario Artist, a suite of creative tools for Nintendo's Japan-only disk drive add-on. Where Mario Paint on the Super Nintendo had given a generation their first taste of making art and music on a TV screen, Mario Artist pushed further towards genuine content creation. These were tools substantial enough that someone could feasibly end up making their own games, so while Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time inspired the industry by leaping into a new dimension, Mario Artist tried to give people somewhere to put that inspiration. And that's where the seed of what came next was planted, a throwaway minigame called Sound Bomber. It was essentially an outlet for 3D models players could make in Mario Artist. Those objects were dropped into a series of bite-sized challenges about as simple as anything on the Game & Watch. Hit a baseball, stop a needle on a record, dodge an oncoming vehicle. But as the music speeds up and the tasks accelerate, it becomes something closer to Simon Says, an escalating rhythm of immediate comprehension and reaction. Sound Bomber could have been left there, a forgotten minigame in a forgotten corner of Nintendo history, but R&D 1 had other ideas. In the middle of their extraordinary 4-year run, just a few years after Mario Artist, they turned that tiny idea into the crown jewel of their 4-game domination. So what is WarioWare exactly? Every few seconds a brand new game appears with a single word prompt, and you react. Press a button, move the D-pad, win or lose. It's 200 or so microgames distilled to their barest essentials: image, sound, input, consequence. Tiny interactive sketches built around a single legible idea. On their own, most of them would barely register, but WarioWare makes a powerful case for quantity as its own kind of quality. You don't sit with any one game long enough to judge it traditionally. You understand it, respond to it, and move on, and then it's gone. Before you've even processed what just happened, the next thing is already in front of you. It's a game about games not as singular, polished artifacts, but as a torrent of constant consumption, disposable but transformed by the sheer velocity of the experience. Simon says, but every command is a fully realised miniature video game. In that sense, WarioWare feels almost uncertainly prescient in the age of hyperinformation. It anticipated the boom of mobile and web games, an endless parade of apps built around single gestures and simple ideas stretched into full products. It follows the structure of short-form content, the scroll and react rhythm of consuming media in fragments. It even weaponizes memes as cultural units, compressed and remixable little bursts of meaning. WarioWare isn't just a game about games, but a game about the language of games, that set of shared instincts and conventions that players absorb without ever being formally taught. It makes that invisible language visible by reducing everything down to a single command at a time. You see a car careening towards you, and you know to jump. You see a hand extending, and you know to shake it. You see a ball lobbed through the air, and you know to swing. The game doesn't teach you the controls, but assumes you'll feel them. Pretty heady stuff for a guy who eats garlic and farts. If WarioWare had just stopped at being sound bomber with production values, it would still be a pretty incredible product, but it would be just a product, lacking the identity that separates games as art from mere software. WarioWare's greatest strength is in its narrative glue. The whole thing is held together by that titular fictional games company, WarioWare Incorporated, and by a cast of developers who bring their own personality to their microgames. And as the series grew, so did the cast, gradually expanding into a full WarioVerse, visually and tonally distinct from anything in the Mushroom Kingdom. But here, in the first game, you already have 10 characters as distinct as any great indie developer. First, there's Wario himself. The game opens with him watching TV, seeing how much money there is in video games and having the bright idea to make one himself. So he rushes out to buy a laptop and begins his glorious descent into the industry. And I do think it's telling that Wario's weapon of choice is a humble clamshell laptop, the same kind of machine an indie developer might bring to a game jam or industry event to show off their work. Portable, practical, and powerful enough to run smaller scale projects. Of course, being Wario, he immediately realizes that making a fully fleshed out game is boring and difficult, so instead he starts firing out short sketches of ideas, then ropes in all his friends to do the same. There's something funny about Wario's starter microgames being so clearly descended from Sound Bomber. It's like he followed a few tutorials online and published his own versions with custom sound and graphics liberally nicked from Wario Land 4 for good measure. But I digress. Then there's Mona, the perpetually late multitasker, and the first new woman added to the Wario canon in over a decade. Like Captain Syrup before her, she sidesteps the usual archetypes of princesses and power armor entirely. She's something closer to a girl disaster, a person for whom the simplest task seems to demand heroic effort. That comes through in her microgames, which take everyday minutiae like brushing your teeth, steering a paper plane, or picking your nose, and make them feel strangely high stakes. The nose-picking game alone has become something of a series mascot, returning in almost every entry. There's Jimmy T, the disco-obsessed sports fanatic. His platform for showing off both his moves and his games is a hip flip phone, which he wheels at the dance club like he's collecting numbers for potential flings. Sports have always been an early inspiration for video games, going back to Tennis for Two on the oscilloscope in 1958, likely because they share the same basic logic: artificial rules imposed to create a game. Moving those rules from a field to a screen means players already have a framework for understanding them, and WarioWare knows this. Ski jumping, shooting hoops, hitting a baseball, all present and accounted for, and Jimmy's set is capped by a boss fight that recreates Nintendo's original Punch-Out! That's worth noting. The story mode of WarioWare isn't a Tetris-style endurance test where you simply fail to keep pace. Instead, you push through around 15 minigames of escalating speed before hitting a boss, a longer and more involved challenge. Not really a microgame though, more like a mini-game. Dribble and Spitz are cab drivers in the game's setting of Diamond City, and their microgames have the energy of two guys who spend long nights talking about science fiction. Kaiju fights, rocket launches, robot assembly, the whole genre is fair game. Like sports, sci-fi has always been a natural fit for video games too. Games are their own kind of reality, capable of staging fantasies that would otherwise cost millions on screen. It also helps, as any early developer would tell you, that space is pitch black, great for atmosphere, and even better for a limited graphics budget. What sets their set apart isn't a theme though, but the music. Where every other developer in WarioWare gets a different track per microgame, Dribble and Spitz gets one, a looping Japanese vocal track called Drifting Away. It grounds each microgame to earth after completion, and it reframes the GBA not as a console limited to emulated instruments and wave generators, but as something capable of genuine atmosphere. And the hardware almost improves it. The console's tinny little speaker makes it sound like it's bleeding out of the taxi radio, adding a layer of accidental warmth that makes the whole thing feel like it was found rather than composed. Dr. Krygor, Cat and Anna, and Orbulon are probably the most out there members of Wario's development team. Krygor is a mad scientist, and his microgames are themed around reality. Which is ironic, given that Nintendo R&D1 would lead developers to the ill-fated Virtual Boy, where that system tried to bridge the real and digital worlds before budget cuts and corporate indifference reduced it to a red and black head-mounted catastrophe. Krygor takes a more lateral approach, found photos of nature, animals, and what appears to be several members of the development team repurposed as game art. In 2003, while the rest of the industry was chasing photorealism through polygon counts and texture budgets, R&D1 just used actual photos. Funny how that works. Cat and Anna build on that theme, leaning further into nature with more illustrative art styles and a distinctively Japanese flavour that's unusual for Nintendo. Their story sends them to a pagoda to rescue a prince, or princess depending on the gender you choose at the start of the game, from an evil spirit. For a company that typically irons out cultural specificity in pursuit of universal appeal, it's a small moment of Nintendo letting its heritage show, even if it is very much a pantomime version of it. Then there's Orbulon, an alien of supposedly vast intelligence, which translates into microgames that are a little more mentally taxing than the rest. They run slightly longer to give players time to think rather than just react, identifying the real Game Boy Advance amongst fakes, solving mazes or matching shapes. Its boss stage is the highlight. A send-up of old-school dungeon crawlers where you defeat a crudely drawn monster by spotting spelling mistakes. But if we're talking about send-ups of classic games, we have to end with 9Volt, the pint-sized Nintendo superfan. His microgames are an encyclopedia of the company's history, right down to his boss challenge, based on an actual baseball toy Nintendo produced in the 1970s. He's a stand-in for a very specific kind of kid, the sort who devours Nintendo trivia not because anyone asked them to, but as a way of demonstrating their devotion. The kind who, when they eventually try and make games themselves, lift sprites and sound effects wholesale in a feign of authenticity. When WarioWare came out at the plucky age of 12, that's exactly who I was. I was immediately pulled in by his microgames because they felt like rapid-fire sketch comedy versions of things I half recognised, from Super Smash Bros. Trophies and magazine scans, Balloon Fight, the final stretch of Metroid, Super Mario Bros. But what really fascinated me were the more obscure microgames. The cowboy you shoot with a ray of light until he topples over, the spinning vacuum cleaner controlled with a single button, the extending grabber. I had no idea what any of these things were at the time, and this is where R&D1 reveals that they were the real 9Volt all along, because they weren't random oddities. They were toys and gadgets designed by Gunpei Yokoi years before Nintendo ever made a video game. And even in these micro-sized digitized forms, they're still genuinely fun to play with, enough to make you want to learn more about them and gain a better appreciation for the people responsible. The obsessive fan playing tribute to the obsessive inventor. It's a nicer tribute than any trophy or museum exhibit. WarioWare ends where it started, with Wario throwing everything he has at you in one last bid for your attention. His boss stage is a platformer, borrowing mechanics from microgames you've already played, rendered in rough sketches against a bare grey room, as if he's testing whether you like the idea before he bothers fleshing it out. In a final meta twist, it ends with him grabbing a treasure and making a mad dash to escape, like a miniature version of Wario Land 4 compressed into 90 seconds. For a game with very little actual plot, the meta-narrative is remarkably well considered. Nothing connects the microgames directly, but they're united by something subtler: Wario's ongoing bet on what you'll find interesting. Each fictional developer gets to show off their tastes and obsessions, turning the dial between what they love and what they think a customer might pay for. In that respect, WarioWare is a game about making games, not the tools or the techniques, but the pitch, the constant negotiation between personal vision and audience expectations, between what you want to make and what someone might actually want to play. And once the campaign has made that point, the game starts remixing itself, treating its own microgames less like finished titles and more like raw material. Jimmy T's remixes appear throughout the story, sudden compilations pulling microgames from multiple developers at their highest difficulty, a skill check before you're allowed to continue on. Finish the game and you unlock the Toy Block Tower modes, theme compilations with no lives and no margin for error, boss stages only, or maximum speed, or the hardest possible difficulty strung together without mercy. Then there's the unlockable minigames, expanded versions of a handful of microgame concepts stretched into fuller arcade experiences, including a loving send-up of Sheriff, one of Nintendo's earliest arcade titles. And included are a few multiplayer modes that require no link cable or second device, just two players sharing one GBA, each claiming a shoulder button, competing like it's a plastic tabletop toy. Whether or not that spirit directly inspired the Switch's detachable controllers, it shows the unbroken line between Nintendo's toyetic past and its all-digital future. In that sense, WarioWare feels like the culmination of what the original Game Boy was trying to be back in 1989, not a console-like experience untethered from a TV, but a portable arcade, a machine that could throw hundreds of ideas at you in minutes and not hours, a pocket-sized proof that play doesn't have to be epic or elegant to be electrifying. On a handheld like the GBA, the concept becomes something even more potent. Wario's playable business card. You don't need a big screen or a long pitch, you just hand it to someone, anywhere, and let it speak for itself.
Impressive. Very nice.
While WarioWare frames its games as the work of a team of fictional misfits, it was really the product of hundreds of Nintendo employees, some of whom, like Wario, had never formally worked in game development before. Staff from across the company scribbled ideas onto sticky notes and handed them to the director. First-time programmers riffed on classic Nintendo mechanics. Artists without traditional drawing skills raided photo libraries and drew crude doodles and called it a game. The creative fever it produced felt almost out of character for a company usually so buttoned up about what it put its name to. And yet, only Nintendo could have made it. They had the history with pilfering, the hardware that suited it perfectly, and just enough forward-thinking recklessness to greenlight something that was, in a sense, almost too postmodern for most video game players. The original WarioWare was a moderate success, but it didn't immediately spawn imitators. No other studio looked at it and said, we need to do that. But the franchise kept going, and what's remarkable about how it grew is the logic behind each new entry. Rather than iterating on the microgame formula in a traditional sense by adding more story, more mechanics, or more depth, each WarioWare game instead asked, what does this hardware do that no other hardware does? Then built an entire experience around the answer. The second game of the series, WarioWare Twisted, arrived with a built-in gyro sensor, unusual at the time, and designed every microgame around tilting and rotating the GBA itself. Where the original squeezed almost everything it could from standard hardware without convoluting its prompt play and repeat concept, Twisted had to bring in new hardware to extend its vision, and in doing so it asked a question Nintendo hadn't quite posed before. Previous peripherals like the SNES mouse and the N64 and GameCube microphones had mostly existed to serve specific genres, be it real-time strategy or karaoke. Twisted reversed that logic. Here the input came first. The question wasn't what games could do with motion, it was what motion could do for games. A small but significant inversion, and one that pointed quite directly towards where Nintendo was headed next. WarioWare Touch on the Nintendo DS turned the stylus into its primary input, with microgames built around tapping, swiping, and drawing. Smooth Moves on the Wii used its baton-shaped motion controller as a prop held in absurd positions. Behind your head, like a fish, like a waiter's tray, and dared you to keep a straight face. Game & Wario on the Wii U leaned into the gamepad's asymmetric potential, while Snapped on the DSi used that console's camera to make your body the input. This wasn't just smart design, but a whole philosophy. WarioWare became Nintendo's interactive proof of concept arriving in each console's lifecycle to show players what the new hardware could feel like. In a sense, it was the company's purest expression of the Gunpei Yokoi principle, lateral thinking over raw power. WarioWare never needed better graphics, it just needed a new way to hold a controller. A few entries deserve special attention. WarioWare Inc. Mega Party Games on the GameCube is an interesting case. It's essentially a port of the original GBA game, supposedly greenlit by Satoru Iwata as part of an effort to show off software that couldn't exist on the PS2 or Xbox. Rather than just moving the microgames to a TV screen, the GameCube version rebuilt them into a full multiplayer framework. Up to 4 players, new competitive modes, wild visual filters, all to drive couch-friendly chaos. What the original did for solo play, Mega Party Games did for a room full of people, capturing the same instant react energy but reframed as a social spectacle. WarioWare DIY on the DS is where the franchise got genuinely meta, and not just because it seemed to loop back to Sound Bomber's inclusion in Mario Artist. The premise of WarioWare has always been that Wario outsources his creativity to his friends. DIY took that one step further and outsourced it to you. Using the DS's touchscreen stylus and microphone, players could build their own microgames from scratch. Custom graphics, music, logic that works. It wasn't as sophisticated as a real dev tool, but it struck an interesting middle ground. Approachable enough to be fun and deep enough to produce something genuinely playable. The bonus, beaming your creations to the Wii via DIY Showcase to play on the big screen, was a genuinely charming touch, like the digital equivalent of putting artwork on the fridge. Wario then didn't just break the fourth wall, but handed you tools and demanded a royalty cut. WarioWare Get It Together on the Switch is arguably the series' most structurally ambitious entry. Rather than presenting microgames as abstract, context-free challenges, Get It Together gives you direct control of Wario and his cast taking part in these games directly. The twist is that every character moves differently. 9V automatically skateboards back and forth while attacking vertically with a yo-yo. His mother, 5V, teleports across the screen like a ghost. Some characters can't stop moving and others can't move at all. This transforms the microgame formula into something new. You're no longer just interpreting a prompt and reacting, you're figuring out how to make this specific character with these specific quirks complete the task at hand. The unpredictability is where it finds its comedy. Watching a character with no mobility try and launch a rocket or tidy a messy room is consistently funny, and with the entire campaign playable in co-op, plus global scoreboards and a rotating weekly challenge, Get It Together made the fullest use of the Switch's social design of any game in the series. And you can't talk about WarioWare without at least a detour to its spiritual sibling, Rhythm Heaven. The two series come from the same development team and operate on a kindred design philosophy approached from opposite directions. Where WarioWare asks you to react, Rhythm Heaven asks you to listen. Rather than processing visual information at speed, you're internalizing a musical pattern and becoming part of it. Players don't just keep time, their inputs are woven into the composition itself, making you feel less like you're playing along and more like you're part of the music. The scenarios, like WarioWare, sit in that zone between mundane and surreal. One moment you're performing in a traditional Japanese music ensemble, and the next you're plucking stray hairs from a sentient onion. And like WarioWare, Rhythm Heaven found its best early entry on the GBA, where its short, loopable compositions mirrored the pick-up-and-play design of handheld gaming. As it moved through the Nintendo DS and Wii, the team showed real awareness of how hardware shapes rhythm gameplay. Famously, the Wii version abandons motion controls for just the A and B buttons, knowing that imprecise gestures would ruin timing-based challenges. With a new Rhythm Heaven finally coming to Nintendo Switch, both series look set to continue on as long as Nintendo hopefully do. So if you've never played a WarioWare, where should you start? For the fullest and most comprehensive experience, try WarioWare Gold on the 3DS. It pulls microgames from nearly every entry in the series, layers in touchscreen, gyro and microphone inputs, and is packed with tons of collectibles to chase after. It's pretty much the definitive package. If you want chaos for friends, smooth moves on Wii or move it on Switch, and a Joy-Con to someone who's never played a game in their life and watch what happens. But if you want to understand where it all began, that original GBA game is still remarkable. There's a fast and focused clarity to it that makes it feel like a thesis statement. And that's what I keep coming back to, years after first playing it, thinking about it critically and writing about it on YouTube. WarioWare wasn't made by the most powerful team in Nintendo, it wasn't their biggest budget, their flagship franchise, or definitely not their safest bet. It was made by a group of people who understood better than almost anyone that the most interesting question in game design isn't how do we make this bigger, it's how do we make this matter. Their answer was to strip it back, find the thing underneath, the reflex, the half second where your brain makes a connection and your hands follow. That spirit is probably why the franchise has never really worn out its welcome. Each entry earns its existence not by adding more to the story or deeper mechanics, but by finding something new to do with the hardware it lives on. It's not sequel logic, but scientific curiosity, asking what can be squeezed from a new screen, a new inputs, and a new way of holding the thing in your hands. Everything else, the story, the onboarding, the genre, the roadmap, is machinery. WarioWare argues that games don't need to stand alone to make an impact, it's the sheer quantity that creates the momentum. A mixtape where what gets chosen and how it's sequenced ends up saying something about the people who made it and the works that inspired them. Which is why its influence on independent developers has been so exciting to watch. I guess you could call them WarioWare likes. I've covered a few on this channel, and what's been most interesting is how developers have used the format as scaffolding for other genres entirely. Spookware and Knuckle Sandwich both use microgames as skill checks tucked inside of an adventure game and RPG respectively. Mindwave borrows the framing to explore the idea of delving into other people's mental landscapes. And then there's Fish-like, which is more or less exactly what it sounds like, WarioWare but about fish, with a lovingly crude art style and soundscape. 20-year and change on, developers are still finding new things to do with WarioWare, whether officially or not, and that's really excellent to see. But after everything I've said, if someone asks you what WarioWare is, don't explain it. Just hand it to them. Wario will do the rest. Thanks to the essay library for the opportunity to revisit one of my favourite games of all time. Let me know in the comments what your favourite WarioWare microgame is, and if there's any other indie WarioWare likes I should check out. This video was made possible as always by my lovely supporters on Patreon. I'm James, and I'll see you all in the next upload.